welcome to Battling with Business with Gareth Tennant and Chris Kitchener. You know the drill by now. This is a podcast where we explore ideas and concepts around leaders and leadership, teams and teamwork, and all things in between. I'm a former Royal Marines officer. Chris is a product manager from the world of software. And last week, we were in the middle of a conversation with Dr. Waitman Beorn talking about small team leadership and his experience in the US Army Cavalry. So let's jump straight back into that conversation where I'm trying to compare my experiences in counter-piracy operations with Waitman's experiences running a tank platoon. Yeah, in a previous episode, which we've already sort of alluded to, I talked about small team tactics and building successful small teams. And I talked about when I was doing counter-piracy operations, which is similar to the US Marine VBSS teams. So a small team, sort of section size or squad size, so probably 8 to 10 people. And I talked about how different it was running a team of 8 to 10 specialists versus being a troop or platoon commander where you've got 30 and each section has their own section commander. And so there's already a hierarchy. And I went from platoon command in combat in Afghanistan to counter-piracy small team command. But for you, you're doing that simultaneously because you've got your big team, you've got your 4 vehicles and they're all sub-teams, but you are also in that tank with the 3 other guys. And I talked about the fact that I, as a small team commander, it was first name terms. It was very, because we were living in each other's pockets, because it was a very small team that relied on each other in almost every aspect of what we did. It was very different to when I was a troop commander. But for you, you can't do that. So can you talk about the difficulties and the dynamic of having your intimate team of 4 that you are commanding as a vehicle and how you balance that against commanding the wider team?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that immediately jumps out at me is I mentioned earlier what happens if your vehicle breaks. Or, if we're talking about a combat situation, if your vehicle gets destroyed or damaged or something. If you survive, or again, if we're make it a little bit less dramatic, if your vehicle breaks, you will get on another vehicle.
Yeah.
And I will call, Blue 2 and be like, Blue 2, come over here. And like, congratulations, you now have my broken vehicle and I'm taking your vehicle, but I also take your crew.
I was about to say, do you swap crews?
No, the crew stays with the vehicle. Yeah. So you can really tell the difference when you jump on somebody else's vehicle with their crew. I mean, it's almost like living in someone else's house because everything is slightly different and the dynamic, you don't know the people the same way. And it goes back to what it's like to have and again, this is when you have a good crew. I mean, at one point I had a gunner that was not quite as good and was kind of struggling, and it makes things more difficult if you have to sort of worry about it. My first gunner is a guy named Rogelio Fulanara, who was from the Philippines, or no, he's Puerto Rico, I think. But we called him the Jedi because he was just an amazing, I mean, like, he was great and I didn't have to do anything.
I never got a good nickname like that. I want to be called the Jedi.
I mean, we called him like Magic Fingers because he was just, he was great with the gun. I never had to think about it. I think the dynamics within the crew, I mean, we're never on a first name basis. That just isn't the way that we do things. But particularly like my crew in in Iraq, it's like a family in the sense that, and I'm not trying to glamorize it or romanticize it, but you understand everybody's sort of routines, their foibles, the things that sort of get on their nerves or, don't. So for example, I'm not a morning person, which I know I picked the wrong job to be in the military, but I don't really like mornings. I don't like getting up. And my crew knew that. And so like when we'd get up, you'd have stand to where everybody gets up and every vehicle's ready. And, I did not like that. And they knew that, and they just wouldn't interact with me until I crack the first joke of the day, and then they're like, okay, everything's fine. Like lieutenant's ready to go. But like they not that they tiptoed around me. I mean, I wasn't like a baby, but like, they knew when to joke with me and when not to, right? And I knew the same thing about them. And I knew, that in my first tank, my gunner, because it was basically his tank, and he was like a neat freak. And he, there's certain things you don't do, like you don't eat peaches in a tank. Because it's partially you don't eat canned peaches. It's partially a superstition, but also because if you spill them, they're like sticky peach syrup everywhere, and it becomes a giant mess, And I knew like to keep it clean because he would get mad if I made a mess in the turret, right? And so like these are things that you understand, and this isn't rocket science, right? I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to basic respect for people and understanding,
See, you say it's not rocket science, and I mean, you are obviously right, but I think, and this is the whole reason why we ramble on for hours and hours, things that are obvious to other people or obvious in retrospect are not as obvious necessarily at the time. There will have been businesses where you've got small groups and they fail miserably. You would have had presumably vehicles where everyone knew, yeah, those guys, they hate each other, and if push comes to shove, things will go badly. So I am a great believer in not underestimating the basics.
Well, I mean, a good example of this, I think, I had my first driver, and I think I also think a piece of evidence for sort of how meaningful and important these small group relationships are is the fact that 20 years later I still remember all their names, right? So Jamali Samuel was my driver, and he came to my unit. So you asked the question like what it was like to come to my unit. Well, what was really cool is that when I first came to my unit, we were fielding the new M1A2 SEP V2 tank. So we literally got issued brand new tanks right when I got there.
With the new tank smell.
Oh, the new tank smell. I mean, we christened them. I have like a picture of me smashing a bottle of champagne against the foot of my tank to name it. All this stuff, right? And I had two brand new soldiers, Jamali Samuel and Vincent, who was my my loader. And then I had this really well experienced gunner. And Samuel was the nicest guy. Like he was just the most soft-spoken kid. And he was my driver. And when we went to the field, I would cuss that kid up and down and just yell at him left or right. God damn it, go right, go right, go right. No, left. I mean, because this is what happens when you're in a vehicle, right? I mean, you're because you're trying to, not throw track, not drive in the wrong spot. It's a middle of in this case, sort of simulated combat. Things are stressful. And I would yell at him, and I would sometimes cuss him out, not like brutally, but I'd be like, what are you doing? But very often at the end of the day, when we're coming in from the field, I would drive and I'd let him be the commander, be up in the turret and take my spot. I mean, obviously my gunner was, managing the tank, looking out, but I'd put him up there and I'd get in the driver's seat and drive back. Now, part of it is because I wanted to drive and it's fun and you don't get to drive the tank as an officer. But part of it is also like, look, it's very obvious but unsaid thing that like, look, none of this is personal. And like you're a really great driver. And he got to be really, really good. And I think he knew too that just because I was yelling at him, like it wasn't like the toxic kind of, screaming at somebody. It was just the way things are, but you make those or you joke about it afterwards, you're like, oh man, like I really made a mistake here. I really did this other thing or crashed the tank or got the tank stuck and these kinds of things. But it's again, and this is again, I say it's not rocket science, but it's just leadership by example. It's just you are there to be in that tank. And if you don't have to leave it for whatever for a sort of mission reason, if my tank gets stuck, because one time I remember one time at Fort Hood, this is when I was in a tank. It was that we were doing a night attack simulated, right, training, It was pouring down rain, just bucketing down rain. And we drove into a filled in vehicle fighting position. So basically, this is like when you dig a foxhole for a tank. So the tank can sort of be underground with just a turret above. And they filled it. It had been filled in from a previous exercise, but the dirt was loose because it wasn't sort of. And when it got, we sunk all the way down to the turret, is how deep we were in this. And it's pouring down rain, and it's like November, so it's just cold. And I had to call my platoon sergeant to try to pull me out. And in order to get to the tow hooks, we literally had to dig down into the mud just to get to where we hit but we were all out there. We were all out. I was not sitting in the tank on the radio. We were all out in the rain, getting cold and wet and disgustingly muddy. And eventually we had to take 2 tanks to pull us out because that's how stuck we were. But and again, it's not massively insightful, but there are other people who would make different choices or stand around and watch or whatever. But you get out and you help and you get dirty.
I wonder whether the small team thing, though, I mean, you've said multiple times with a lot of humility, which I think is another good leadership sign, is, none of it's rocket science, but I wonder whether another way to describe small team leadership in this way is it's real-time feedback. So you said it brilliantly earlier. You've got nowhere to hide. When you're not in that small unit, when I'm talking to my team, if I screw up or do something stupid, there's a pretty fair chance people didn't see it, or I can make people look the other way. There's places to hide, whereas you were literally in a place where everyone could see what you were doing, and what's more, everyone could see what everyone else was doing. I mean, I would imagine weak members of the team become obvious really quickly. And
and I think one of the challenges, to get back to the earlier question, one of the challenges is when things aren't going well, right? I mean, it's all great when you have that perfect team, like my first tank. For most of my tank platoon time was great. But eventually I had to promote my gunner because he was good and he deserved a tank of his own. And I had to do it, which was unfortunate because I liked him a lot and he did a really good job, but I gave him his own vehicle. Because he got promoted, he made rank and it was his time. And I got another gunner who was not nearly as good as that guy. And it's almost like having a second wife and expecting the second wife to do all the things that the first wife did, or comparing kids or whatever, they're different people. And I had to supervise him a lot more. I had a lot less confidence in him than I had in the other guy. And, it caused, stress because, I would chew him out in a way that I never had to chew out the other guy. And the same way, when you're in a larger unit or a corporation, you can call somebody in your office and say, you did a crappy job about this. I need you to fix yourself. And then they'll leave. But when I tell my gunner, you totally messed this up, I don't expect you to ever do that again. Roger, sir. And then he's sitting 2 feet away from me for the rest of the time. You're because that's just the way it is, right? It's a different. You have to, and I think for me maybe that was challenging because nobody likes conflict, and nobody likes to sit with conflict. But you have to in a small group, and if you get mad at somebody, or if they get mad at you, you have to kind of sit there literally with it because it's in there.
There's several things that we're drawing out here that are really important, and one is, as you said, Chris, that when you're in these situations and there's nowhere to hide, people's weaknesses are exposed. But the way you described it is you said weak people. Actually, we're all weak. We all have weaknesses and strengths, and they all get exposed. And what you end up doing is, as a group, is realizing that everybody has vulnerabilities. You know, as you said, Waitman, you're not a morning person. And so the team normalizes around that and they accept that. And the things that can be developed and the things that can be taught, learnt, exercised, practiced are, and so weaknesses are slowly eroded out of the team. And of course, there are inbuilt things that are just never going to change.
Well, I was going to say, there's the line, which is there's things that you can develop with people, and you say that wasn't great, do it again, but they have the potential. And then there's presumably the line where you say, you are going to get me killed one day, and for the safety of my team and for the sake of the mission,
I'd say
you shouldn't be a part of the team.
That's quite a rare circumstance. And actually, what you end up doing is developing people to a point where they are competent and work.
I mean, I think that's the thing, you know, and I'm not the first person to say this, but you know, most people don't join an organization, the military or anything else, in order to do a bad job at it.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people even the military and elsewhere, if they're doing a bad job of their job, it may be, and this may be optimistic, but it may be because they haven't been properly trained in how to do it. And so, you know, in some ways, ultimately, you know, that's your job. Where it becomes difficult is for an officer, particularly a junior officer, to train an NCO in something that he should have learned how to do from other NCOs a long time ago.
Yes.
You know, and I think that's a challenging position, because that's a position where, you know, you have the responsibility and you have the authority, but you may not have the authority of experience. You know, that's your job. Where it becomes difficult is for an officer, particularly a junior officer, to train an NCO in something that he should have learned how to do from other NCOs a long time ago.
Yes.
You know, and I think that's a challenging position, because that's a position where, you know, you have the responsibility and you have the authority, but you may not have the authority of experience. Compared to, for example, I'll give you an example, like an actual anecdote. You know, one of the things that, again, this does not make me Alexander the Great, but officers eat last. Officers eat last, and the senior NCO, my platoon sergeant, eats last. So the whole platoon eats first. I eat last. My platoon sergeant, the standard thing was, if we were eating as a group, which you don't always do, because sometimes you pick up your food when you pick up your fuel, and so it's whatever order you do that in. But if say we're at gunnery and everyone's going to eat, then, you know, the whole platoon goes. Sergeant Yankee and I stand at the end of the line drinking coffee or whatever until everybody's eaten. And once they've all gone through the line, he goes before me and I go after him and I get food. This is not an amazingly innovative tactic. I think most everybody does this.
So,
but I had a when I took over my second platoon, I had an E6 platoon sergeant. So that's normally an E7 slot. It's normally a sergeant first class slot. I had a guy who was run rank below that, who was filling the position, and he was weak. And I had to, you know, at one point he was eating, and I was like, "What are you doing? Like, you don't eat. Like, you stand here with me, and we eat last. Like, this is not. What are you doing?" Right? But that was awkward, because I shouldn't have to certainly have to tell an E6, a staff sergeant, that like, this is not the way we do things. But by that point, I was a senior first lieutenant, and I've been around long enough to know a good deal about at least what NCOs should be doing in terms of general leadership and how they should be doing their job. You know, and so those kinds of corrections were easier for me, because I had the authority both of my rank, which is the weakest kind of authority, as well as the authority of my experience, which was that, like, hey, you know, I'm not some fresh kid off the block that has no idea what he's doing. Like, but it was difficult, you know, to be like, hey, come on, Sergeant, what are you doing? Like, stop. You can't do that.
But I think it's really interesting that you're finding something difficult that is a relatively well understood cultural practice that is actually doesn't, the eating last when you're on the ranges or wherever, doesn't change the output of the team. It's a second order effect. It creates the conditions where you have the right culture. It creates a dynamic where you are making a statement. Going back to your point earlier, Chris, where you said in the commercial world, our teams are optimized for the output. We don't have time for, learning in exercises. We don't have time to shadow people and bring them on. I would counter that and say we've talked many times on this podcast about situations where inefficiency is created at the point where the crisis exists. Everything we're talking about here, the time where you were, digging out your tank in the rain on an exercise, you weren't at war. At the time you're standing in the line, waiting for chow, telling a senior NCO that they need to stand back and let the soldiers go first, you're not at war. And what it does is it means that by the time you get to war, you are not quite ready. You're never ready. You have to adjust quite quickly to the combat situation, and it is always different. But you've done a huge amount of preparation. When we're talking in the commercial world about operations, there's no capacity for exercising. There's no capacity for identifying where people are weak and therefore bringing them on and developing them. Or I say no capacity, that's unfair.
No, but it's
nowhere near as much.
It's a limited and ad hoc, and I think everyone gets this, otherwise we wouldn't be here. I think there needs to be more.
Yes.
But I think there are people who lack the visceral experience of having done that.
Yep.
So to some degree, Waitman, these things to be self-evident because you have lived them, and very quickly, if you didn't do these simple things, bad things would happen. Whereas in commercial organizations, there's a different set of motivations and history. Well, how often does something really go badly wrong? Well, really badly wrong, maybe once a year. Well, we could make some extra money by doing more of X project in that time, or we could save that money for a rainy day. I think it's something that leadership teams in the commercial world need to really think carefully about.
Yeah.
This is, do we want to be good or do we want to be the best? We can be good and not do these things. We could be the best and do them. So I think it's just the natural setup. Perhaps a different way of saying this. I think the military, this is going to sound terrible, has the advantage where you are training for a kinetic, life-threatening outcome. And so people are very, very thoughtful about training for success.
Yeah.
These things are the cliche life and death. In a commercial world, they are rarely so. And so the motivations are different. So it's hard. But I wanted to come back. Wait,
just one thing off of that. I think another one of the differences between the commercial world or the corporate world is that you can fire people.
Yes.
You can fire people in the military. Yes, you can relieve people of command, et cetera, et cetera. But that's very much a nuclear option. And it's also oftentimes very difficult to do, because either you have nobody to replace them, or it's just an administrative issue. I mean, I remember, as an example, we were on a field exercise, and my senior scout fell asleep, and his whole crew must have been asleep, because I kept calling him on the radio, and I'm like, hello, like, to the extent that I found his vehicle and we drove up next to it, and I got out of the vehicle with a sledgehammer and pounded on the turret until he opened the hatch. He popped the hatch out, and he looked like, a newborn baby. And I fired him on the spot. I said, "You're fired." Now, really, he was just fired for the rest of the exercise, because I was so hot. I was so mad. I'm like, "You're done. Like, you're fired. Like, get in the gunner's seat. Your gunner is now in command of your track." And that had the right effect, but he wasn't fired for good. He wasn't kicked out of the army. You certainly don't do that. I was stuck with him, but that was a sort of, wake up call kind of thing. But in the military, you can't fire people as easily. You can't get rid of them, even if they're awful. I mean, for when I got to my first platoon, I had a guy on the rolls for like 4 or 5 months who had been AWOL for like a year. I mean, like he'd been gone. So I think for better or for worse, you have to train the people that you have.
But isn't that great though?
Get rid of them.
It changes your perspective on things. I get, you hire people to be good enough for the thing you need them for in the commercial world. And then 6 months later, if they're not good enough, there's this terrible, we need to get rid of them. You need to manage them out is the dreadful phrase in the commercial world, as opposed to, and I actually had this in a previous organization where I think, you lie to yourself after these. I said to the CEO, you're very keen for this person to leave. Has anyone tried to give this person the skills that would mean they didn't leave? And almost the implication, which I feel quite strongly in many cases, there are some times when just the wrong person in the wrong place and it's bad for them and bad for you, but letting people go because of the lack of skills, I think reflects more on the organization, or as much on the organization as it does on the person. So
we need to take a short break now. We'll be right back.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, the one leadership moment that I'm the most proud of from my whole time in the Army was with somebody who had failed. This was in my scout platoon where we got a guy who'd been busted from sergeant. He was a sergeant and he had been demoted to E4. He'd lost a rank. And, he came to my platoon. I took him on my track, even though some people were like, you probably shouldn't do that. And, I pulled him aside. His name was Hayes, Sergeant Hayes. And he was Specialist Hayes at that time. And I pulled him aside on the first day. And because he had come from headquarters, he'd been in the headquarters troop and he had done something. I don't even know what he'd done. He'd done something, gotten in big trouble and gotten busted down. And I pulled him aside. And I said, hey, Sergeant Hayes, or say Specialist Hayes, do you know what I've heard about you? And he's like, oh, sir, like, and I was like, I don't care. I don't care. But what anybody says, you start moment one with me right now. And I said, if you do your job, I'll get you your stripes back and you'll get promoted back to sergeant and you'll be on your way. The look on his face was just like, as if I had sort of given him a reprieve from the hangman, but he did a great job and he got his sergeant and he went on, got promoted above that. And again, it's not amazing, but in my life, I have had people when I've messed up who said, you've messed up big time, but we're not giving up on you. We're not just going to like cash out. We're going to give you a chance to come back from it. And, when you're in an organization that you can't just, kick somebody out when they do something, even things that are really bad, it gives you that opportunity to watch them succeed, which is one of the best feelings as a leader, is when you put your faith in somebody and they do it and you're like, yes, you did it, and I think that's, for me, that's one of the things that makes me feel the best, and it's selfish, makes me feel the best about myself, about my own time in that particular unit, because it wasn't necessarily the easiest thing. And this gets to, I think, what we were talking about earlier in terms of training somebody. It's hard when you have somebody who is not performing to the standard to train them, because it means giving them more responsibility and forcing them to step up and do what they need to do, rather than what often happens. I think this is something that happens in the civilian world as well, where you have a subordinate who does a really good job, and as a result, they get all the jobs, which is not fair to them either. You have something hard you need to be done, or someone needs to stay late, or someone they have a really hard task. You shouldn't always be giving it to the guy who does the best or the lady who does the best in your organization, because you're victimizing them. You're making them, carry the load, but it's also very challenging as a leader to say, okay, I'm going to put Sergeant so-and-so in charge of this vehicle display, knowing that means I'm going to have to do more work myself in watching out for them and supervising them and giving them perhaps more guidance than just saying, oh, well, have Sergeant Johnson do it because I know he's incredible and he'll do it without thinking. Because eventually they start to, your subordinates will start to resent that. Like, how come I always have to do the hard thing? And after a certain point, because you're really good at it, it no longer, makes them feel any better, because it's like, oh, I got to do it again, because I'm the best person to do it.
So you this is probably not right, but sort of you at West Point and through to the time you stepped into a tank, there was a concept of leadership that you were taught and you were trained, for want of a better word, large team leadership. And then you spend time with your teams and you learn. How did that change your perspectives on leadership? I mean, was it like, no, this was just a subset of how we think about it? Or did you walk away with a very different sense of what leadership meant in any situation?
I think so. I mean, I have to first say that leadership at West Point is not the same as the Army. I was not a great cadet at West Point in terms of like the military side of things and like the leadership and like not getting in trouble and cleaning my room and that kind of thing. I wasn't great. And part of that was my immaturity and my own issue. And part of that is it's all peer leadership. So it's all artificial in a certain sense, even though, yes, you're technically a cadet private and I'm technically a cadet lieutenant, you're 3 years behind me. You're from the same basic background. We're all going to be lieutenants in 4 years anyway. It's artificial at a lot of levels. And at its worst, it becomes kind of a rinky dink sort of like situation. It's not the Army by any stretch. I think one of the things where I grew the most as a person was in keeping my ego in check, because I have a feeling as a cadet, and before I graduated, you at West Point at a certain level, you can't help but think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread because you're going to be a West Point officer, blah blah blah. Now, I didn't fall into that to that extent, but being in the military and being in the kind of units that I was in helped me very quickly to put myself in the right sort of perspective of, that I have a lot to learn from everyone around me. And I think one of the biggest challenges for both junior leaders as well as someone coming into a new situation is when you have the responsibility, but not necessarily the authority of experience. Yeah. So like from day one, like when I came to my platoon, if the next day one of my soldiers had gotten driven their car drunk into the front of a restaurant, I'd be in front of the commander and he'd be asking me what the hell's going on with this soldier, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, sir, it's my responsibility. We'll take care of it. Even though I literally had nothing to do with it at that point. It's challenging. I think one of the biggest challenges for leaders coming into the military in that sense is balancing that. Balancing, I don't know a lot of things with I'm still responsible. And the example that I'll use is, I don't know, Gary, they have this in the Marines, but there's this thing in the Army called NCO business where they're like, sir, that's NCO business. And that's like warning, like the hairs in the back of your neck should go up at some level, right?
Yes.
At the functional level, it means there are certain things that are just not your job to worry about. My job as an NCO is to deal with these things. It's not your job. And in fact, it's insulting if you as an officer get down in my business and try to tell me how to do the things that I'm supposed to do. It's dysfunctional when NCO business means we're doing things that are shady and we don't want you to know what those things are because they're not necessarily above board.
Yeah.
And the challenge for an officer, I think, often is to walk that line. And so and this is something that I was very clear on in the beginning, which was I said, look, I'm not going to tell you how to suck an egg. I'm not going to tell you, but I need to know. I need to know what you're doing. So if I ask you what you're doing, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm asking you because I, want to tell you to do it differently. But if the commander comes to me about something, I need to know what it was. So an example, let's say a soldier is substandard in some way, uniform or whatever. If I say, let's say he's not good at physical training, he's not doing well on his physical tests. NCO I'm going to say, Private so-and-so needs to have a better score. And Sergeant so-and-so is going to say, Roger, sir, I got it. Now, I may say, Sergeant, what's your plan for getting this guy, and that's not because I'm going to tell him, I think you should take him on 2-mile runs and then do this and another thing. But also it's not, I don't want to have it be, sir, it's NCO business because he's going to take the guy out back behind the headquarters and beat the crap out of him. Right. So, I mean, like, this is the balance, right? Is that I need to know what your plan is. I need to know what you're doing, but I don't necessarily need to tell you how to do it. And you don't necessarily have to check with me.
I think the example there was demonstrate to me that you have a plan that will achieve the outcome. I almost don't care what the plan is, but I want you to demonstrate you have a plan. You didn't just say, sure, we'll take care of this.
Right. But the challenge then becomes, for example, in maintenance, right? Because one of the things that is self-evident is that something that's very different when it comes to a light infantry unit versus a mechanized unit is that maintenance is a big deal because you're maintaining these giant vehicles. And so, if I need a new part and all of a sudden the part appears and I say, where'd that part come from? And I hear, don't worry about that, sir, it's NCO business. Like, then like that, the hairs in the back of my neck go up because I'm like, where did you get that? Right? Where did it come from? Because if you've stolen it or gotten it in some other shady kind of way, I could be on the hook for that. Right. And just saying, oh, don't worry about that, sir. It's like, no, I need to worry about that because I'm the one that's going to get fired if it turns out that, you stole that from some other unit or whatever. Right. So it's balancing this ability of recognizing what the areas of expertise are for your various people in your unit, letting them do their job, versus being in command of the information. Right. And this is one of the areas where, an example from my unit, where we had an officer who had been prior service. He had been enlisted before he became an officer, and every commissioning source and every route to commissioning has its positives and negatives. Right. So I'm not suggesting that someone from an academy or from ROTC or prior service is better or worse than anybody else. But in this particular instance, his NCOs really didn't like it because he'd been an NCO, and kind of some of the ways that he led as an officer were much more similar to NCO stuff. And he was telling NCOs how to do their job. And they were like, sir, you're not an NCO anymore. You're a lieutenant. Like, we got this, stop telling us how to do our job. And I think that's something that, again, is a symptom of understanding where you fit in the ecosystem of the leadership chain and how you should be doing things. And it's also demonstrating trust in your subordinates, eventually, that like, you're not going to screw me over by stealing an engine from the unit next door or whatever. I don't know if that makes sense in terms of,
completely. Well, look, we're coming towards the end and we've not taxed your historical knowledge yet. And we did one of our influencers episodes, and I think you can settle something for us once and for all.
Oh, man.
Gareth doesn't know I'm going to ask this, but I bet he's going to have a pained look on his face. Erwin Rommel, great tactician and strategist, or terrible? What's the Waitman Beorn historical armored warfare view? Look, you can't see this, everyone, but Waitman's smiling, waving his head around, and now stroking his chin.
Look, I'm not a military historian, nor do I claim to be. My sense from everything that I've ever sort of read or imbibed is that Rommel is a guy who's promoted beyond his abilities. And if you look at it, he does have on his face a meteoric rise from essentially a battalion regimental commander to a division to a corps in an absurdly short amount of time. And by all accounts, he was quite good in the Battle of France and quite good, as a regimental commander, etc. And in the First World War, and then woeful in the desert in the sense of, I think this is one of those situations where people say, look, Rommel was so great, and if only he had more gas and tanks and ammunition, he would have been amazing.
And artillery and a worse enemy.
But that's part of being a leader, is like once you get to a certain level, logistics is just as important as anything else. And so
listen to that.
Brilliant tactician, operationally poor.
Well, I think we won. I mean, the woeful.
But you can't be at some point you can't be a brilliant tactician if your tactics exist in a space outside of the realm of logistics.
I completely agree, but I think that's where the over promotion comes in, because you can at the platoon level, you can at the squadron or company level to an extent. Once you start getting to regiment, brigade, certainly at division, you absolutely can't.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, and I was never in my, because again, I was only in the Army for 5 years. So I was never the support platoon leader, and I was never a company commander. So, as a platoon leader, the fuelers showed up, and somebody told me, here's where the fuelers are. Here's a grid coordinate. I'd show up, I'd get gas, I'd go out and do great things. I never had to worry about like how much fuel am I consuming on a daily basis, and like how much ammunition, and like where is it coming from, and one of the things that I've gotten a greater appreciation for in listening to the We Have Ways podcast, for example, is logistics. It's just, how much time and effort goes into, and this is somebody who's in the military, but I think in many ways I took it for granted, how much time and effort goes into getting that every gallon of fuel from, a refinery in the States to my fuel tank in Iraq. I mean, that's amazing. And it's thankless work, that nobody gets any credit for unless it goes wrong, in which case, everyone's immediately like losing their minds. But getting back to Rommel and to the Germans in general, part of it, people say, how could the Germans have won in the Eastern Front? Well, they probably couldn't have. And so probably a good idea is don't attack Russia in the first place, regardless of how tactically proficient you may or may not be, you can't just say, well, I was really good, but I didn't have enough stuff.
Yeah.
Because we don't live in that world.
Agree. Yeah, I completely agree. Which is great to hear. I think it's been it's once again, Waitman, we are internally grateful because
this is just an excuse to hear cool, interesting stuff.
Well, I was going to say, we've been talking for over an hour now, and we've not actually told any war stories at all, and I think that's indicative of there's so much to get into in just the cultural aspects of how you do small team leadership, but also development of leaders of small teams that builds them. And I think we've alluded to this quite well in this podcast. You build people through experience, allowing them enough rope to make mistakes, but not enough to hang themselves. You surround them with experienced people. You force them into situations where they have to make judgment calls, and then you promote them to the next level and let them do it all over again. And you do it iteratively in a culture where you can't get rid of people because they're not performing to, the best standard. And how often do we hear in the commercial world people say really lovely things like, I want to recruit people because they've got the right values and I can train them later. And then they don't give them any space to train and learn. And, you get quarter 2, quarter 3 in, and they're like, we need to manage this person out because they're not performing. In the military, you don't do that. And we talked about, and I love the fact that we got into the small teams expose people's weaknesses. And rather than that being everybody point fingers, get rid of them because we want the best team, you've got to, as my troop commander when I was in training would put it, you've got to piss with the cock you've got.
I'm sorry.
So you have to work with the team that is there. And you do that on exercise, you do that in camp, you do that in operations, because you can't sack people.
Well, and this is something that we didn't talk about, because we didn't really talk about gunnery, but one of the things that I think highlights that is that in order to be deployable, and then also a big deal as sort of a leader, is you have to be part of a qualified crew, meaning that you have taken your crew, your tank, downrange, and you go through a series of 8 different firing tables, where table 8 is the last most difficult one that is your qualification, right? And you have to pass that in order to have a qualified crew. And that's a readiness statistic, just along with how many vehicles are working, is how many qualified crews do you have? But that qualified crew is specific to those 4 people. And if somebody moves out, you now have an unqualified crew. So you can't, for example, you can't pass Sergeant so-and-so to each tank because he's great and have him shoot the gunnery for every tank. It's those 4 guys. And those 4 guys are part of that qualified crew. And if you break up that qualified crew, then all of a sudden you are tracking that this is a readiness issue, that we don't have a qualified crew.
Yeah.
So, it is exactly that, these are the people that you go to war with, because these are the people that you have, and you qualify, you go downrange with that crew, because you can't just, oh, well, Sergeant so-and-so is not very great, let's swap him out with somebody else.
Yeah.
And
that scales up,
designed to make it.
So your qualified crew is part of a platoon, and that platoon is part of a troop and battalion, and that's where the term formed unit comes from, because you are formed
Of these different smaller
all
groups.
up from these different groups, and you go to war as a formed unit. So there's something really, I think, special about the fourth generation of formations to then go and deliver on operations, which...
Well, and I would say one more thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Gareth, but for me personally, you asked sort of what are some of the sort of eye-opening moments or sort of transformational moments for me, and one of them, and this again is very basic, but was being exposed to different people. I grew up in a relatively well-off middle-class household. I went to a private Episcopal school from kindergarten through university, which was predominantly white upper middle class kids. And then I went to West Point, which is slightly more diverse, but again, there's a certain level of sort of high excelling people regardless. I was not exposed to lots of different kinds of people. And one of the really amazing and good things, fundamentally good things about the military, is that it forces people. I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not racist. It wasn't that I, have deep hidden prejudices against anybody, but it forces different people together.
Yeah.
And you have to learn to empathize with and learn from other people who have had different life experiences than you have. Maybe different ethnicities, come from different parts of the country, have different levels of education. And I think, and again, that's just maximized in a tank crew, because you're just with a very, very small group of people, and all of my tank crews, people would come from all over the place, ethnically, socioeconomically, et cetera, and you have to learn how to get along with all those people, and I think that's an incredibly valuable life experience.
Oh, it's almost as if diversity is a good thing.
It is. It's a fantastic thing.
I think we're becoming boring when we talk about this. Look, I mean, you've sort of talked about the things you took away. For me, what I love is your statement, it's not rocket science, is that you've talked about pretty much most of the core leadership ideas we have talked about. And your statement was, there's nothing clever about them. they're all pretty simple. And I think that's really true. And I think that means this is accessible to everyone. And I love that as a way of sort of describing this. Waitman, as always, it's been a real pleasure to have you on. I am disappointed we haven't had stories of peeing in tanks and all sorts of other things.
I mean, I can tell you all about, if you want. It's not.
Well,
it's
I
not,
think we're going to have to leave that for
not an amazing story.
the next
but,
time we come out. No, but this is what everyone wants to hear. This is the clickbait, and we actually got all the serious stuff instead of the clickbait. But look, thank you really very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for I love the stories, and we keep saying this. Our joy is having people on who come and bring us different views and different stories. It's fantastic. We wish you every luck on your podcast. In fact, you don't
Thank you.
luck. You don't need luck at all. And we will be sure to mention it on our podcast and get people to come and talk to it. Look, for people listening, Waitman's been on before. Please go back and listen to the episode that he was on. We've also got all the other episodes to go listen to. We've seen I think it's safe to say, a surge of listeners since Christmas.
We have.
So we're really pleased that we're continuing to sort of grow interest from all parts of the world. If you're listening and you want to get in touch, battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We would love to hear for those of you who indulge in the email. For those of you who exist on the platform formerly known as Twitter, we are Battling with Biz. We genuinely would love to hear from you. We're also grateful for all the people who have been posting reviews. I didn't talk to you about this, Gareth. I was driving home with my son tonight. He said, "Dad, you've got a score of 4.9 on Spotify for your podcast. That's really good." Please keep doing that, people. Please keep writing reviews, recommending us, because it helps us with the algorithms, and we'd love more people to hear about it. Other than that, though, thank you for joining us, and we'll speak to you all very soon. Thanks, Waitman.
Thanks, Waitman.
Thanks for having me, as always. It's great.
Cheerio.